I want to begin with just a little bit of preface here. As the CTO for IBM Watson, I get the opportunity to kind of set our technical strategy. I get to define and guide our teams towards which are the technologies we want to concentrate on and how we're going to apply that to solving for business problems. But I also think that it's very important to have that be guided by a set of principles. And the one principle that I hold very dear to my heart, and one that I think may have even been debated a bit today and perhaps even yesterday a little bit, is this, that cognitive computing is about amplifying human cognition. You know, we can have a lot of discussion about what we mean by artificial intelligence. We can talk about it being a artificial replication of the human mind. We can talk about it in terms of machine learning and deep learning. We talk about it in many different things, but at the end of the day, we got to think about it in the context of the human, the user, the people who are affected and impacted by this technology. And ultimately, we have to think about it in terms of how we not replace the human mind, but how we augment the human mind. How do we take the things that we're really good at, right, and extend that? How do we make it more powerful? How do we make humans more powerful in their thinking than they would be by themselves? And that's not just about providing the right information at the right time. Clearly, that's a big part of it. But it's really about how do you trigger that psychological response in humans that causes us to walk away from a question that we might have had and now come up with a new idea? To be inspired, to be thinking about a problem in a different way, to be able to think about not just the questions that we're thinking to ask, but the questions that we're not thinking to ask, or the answers that we expected, not just simply thinking about those, but how those answers then might help us see through to a different perspective, through a different point of view, or perhaps, if nothing else, at least get through our own biases. Because so much of what we do in terms of the decisions that we make are subjected to our mental models, the expectations we have of the world, and the things that we're expecting to see, the answers we're expecting to find, as opposed to those that perhaps we're not expecting to find. So with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about this in the context of conversational systems, conversational agents, and more specifically in the context of messaging platforms. Because one of the things that we need to recognize is that the world is shifting quickly. Now, we've also talked a little bit about the need to be open, and we agree. When we started the work around Watson, having played the game of Jeopardy, we got inundated with first doctors who felt like there was an opportunity for this thing called Watson, this thing called cognitive computing to help them. Because if you're familiar with that industry, you'll know that there is more information being produced, more material, new science is being captured and documented and expressed than doctors can keep up with on a daily basis. We estimate the doctor has about 5 hours a month to spend reading the latest literature in their field. And yet, if they were to read everything that was published on a weekly basis in their field, they've taken about 160 hours of reading time. Right? Now, there's only 168 hours in the week. So either these guys are incredibly good at multitasking, or more likely, and as we've discovered, they just simply can't keep up with it. And so many of the decisions that they have to make are made without the benefit of the very latest information. And so, they came to us and said, can we do this? Can we help with this problem? And then we got inundated by other people who also saw the opportunity to solve for this very same problem. That is, to be able to deal with the mass overloading information, to be able to assimilate that, get to the right information, and be able to come away with better ideas and better decisions. To the point where we realized very quickly, by in fact about 2014, that we couldn't keep up with it. It was bigger than us. This was a movement that was occurring in our industry, and it wasn't going to be just about IBM. It was going to be about all of us. It was going to be about all the things that you've been hearing about, all the vendors, all the technologies, all the applications of the technology, and that we really needed to shift the way that we thought about the availability of this technology and how we might apply it. And so we created a platform, and we focused on a set of APIs, making those APIs available in the cloud so that anybody can make use of those services to build their own solutions. And I'll come back and tell you a little bit more about what has occurred as a result of that. but I want you to concentrate on that middle of the picture, the purple layer, and the 3 categories of services that we have now made available. We have about 30 services available in the cloud as APIs that anybody can use, and they fall roughly into 3 different categories. And these categories are actually taken from work that Daniel Kahneman did on the Fast and Slow Mind. If you've ever had a chance to read his work, it's definitely worth picking up. Of course, that is a representation of the human mind, but we wanted to be able to have something that people could relate to as they think about the solutions and how they're going to apply these technologies to solving business and social problems. So first, foundational cognitive skills roughly equates to what Kahneman referred to as the fast mind, or system 1, what we would normally roughly refer to as our subconscious, that is our ability to recognize, to identify, and quickly interpret a situation. The second category is what we call higher reasoning skills, right? This is, again, what Kahneman referred to as the slow mind. The things that take cognitive energy, the things that actually consume calories, the things that we typically associate with our conscious thinking, that's what we mean by higher reasoning skills here. And then knowledge organization skills, which you could roughly equate to the kinds of things that we do at night when we're asleep, right? In our dreams, we're taking the experiences of the day, right, and reorganizing, moving it from short-term memory to long-term memory. The same thing are the kinds of things that we're talking about doing in knowledge organization skills. And even though we don't have perfectly even distribution of capability across all these 3 different categories, this is the way that we organize our services. This is how we align our technology investments to make sure that what you end up with is something that you can make use of and has applicability to the kinds of problems you want to solve. Right? But let me go back to messaging. Now, messaging platforms have become ubiquitous. Right? They are everywhere. There are literally dozens now of messaging platforms representing billions of monthly active users. And of course, you recognize some of the logos up here. These are only just a small sampling of all the different messaging platforms out there. And the reason I want to bring up messaging platforms isn't because this is something that we all are ignoring. In fact, I know that a lot of us are paying very close attention to it. It is, I think, indicative of a fundamental shift that businesses throughout the world are beginning to get exposed to or experience or take advantage of. And that is that it's not so much about trying to get your clients to come to you anymore, right? Most businesses are set up with the idea that they're going to try to attract clients, and those clients are going to come to them. They're going to come through their portals. They're going to come to them through their bricks and mortar. They're going to come to them through whatever channels they make available to them. But largely, it's about the businesses setting up shop and then trying to attract customers, clients, to come to them. What's important about messaging platforms is that it changes that dynamic, and it sort of suggests that now businesses need to be thinking about how they get to their clients. How do they go to their clients where they already exist? As I said, billions of people are already using these messaging platforms. They use it in their daily life. They've been using them for a whole variety of reasons, not the least of which, of course, is to fulfill their social needs. But that's where they are. That's where they spend the majority of their day. And so when you are thinking about how you get to your clients rather than expecting them to come to you, maybe you ought to be thinking about how you go to them. And this is a trend that's starting to happen. We've seen this in the way of chatbots that are now being integrated into these messaging platforms. But I also think that this is something that's going to be fundamentally different about the future of business throughout the world, which is that it's going to shift from how do I get you to imagine what we could do to actually creating trusted relationships with you, to move from classic ad banner styles of attention making to now, I exist in your life because I'm not here just to simply sell you something. I'm here to help you get through some life event. You know, the example I like to use is that when people get up, when people decide to go buy a mortgage, right? It wasn't that they woke up this morning and said, hell, all my friends have mortgages. I want one too. There was something going on in their life, right? There was an event occurring in their life that matters to them. They are moving and buying a house, right? They have children that perhaps are either starting school or ending school. They have a new job. There's all these sort of things going on in their life. And so for a bank to spend their time simply trying to sell you on buying a mortgage without being aware of the rest of that life event is actually a little bit disempowering, right? If, on the other hand, a bank can now demonstrate their ability to provide attention to your life event and to answer the questions that you might have about the neighborhood and the educational system and the lifestyle opportunities that exist in the places where you're thinking about buying this house or where you're selling a house, and in doing so creates a more trusted relationship with you, then suddenly the opportunity to sell you a mortgage becomes much stronger. The conversion rates occur at a much higher rate. But that's not something that you can do simply by placing a bunch of people in a call center and having them answer questions. It's just not economically viable. It's the reason why businesses don't do this today, right? You can't afford the number of people that it takes and all the different knowledge that they must have in order to be able to answer those kinds of questions, to be able to provide that level of attention outside of the domain of what you're trying to sell. And this is where I think conversational systems begin to really have an impact on our society and on the relationships that people have to their businesses, right? So I think that this trend towards messaging platforms is not just about having a different way of connecting to people. It's about having a different kind of connection to people. It's about having a connection that is more meaningful to the people that you're interested in entertaining. So these messaging platforms are important. And of course, what you can do with them are quite substantial. And when you introduce a chatbot, a conversational agent, the kinds of things you can do through that conversational agent are quite varied. It doesn't necessarily have to be just about answering questions. Obviously, that's something that people want to be able to do. But it's about answering a whole variety of things. It's about doing things for people, right? It's about giving them insight and inspiration. Yeah, it may be about selling products as well, but ultimately you're trying to help them solve a problem. And if in the process of solving that problem, you're able to also sell them a product, great, right? But first and foremost, you're trying to deal with them in the problems that they're trying to deal with. Now, it also turns out that a lot of these messaging platforms are getting quite sophisticated. I've given you an example here of a chat bot being presented through WeChat. It's a messaging platform, but notice that the user experience here almost looks like a web application in terms of its richness, or even a local mobile application. So these conversational systems and the messaging platforms are not limited to what we would normally expect. It's not just about a person typing in a piece of text, a question, and then getting another piece of text coming back out, answering that question, perhaps in a dialog box. These things can get quite sophisticated in terms of the experiences that we can create with them. So that opens up all kinds of possibilities. Now, if we think about the general pattern of how a conversational agent is constructed, it typically looks something like this. We've got some sort of user interface that is created on one of our devices. It could be through a chat-based interface, a text-based interface, or just a general phone-based interface. But nonetheless, that typically sits at the front end. And then we have something that is able to look at the kinds of utterances, the expressions that people post through that interface. Right? And that could be in a textual form, it could be in a vocal form. It doesn't really matter. In fact, I think as we go forward, you're going to see that there's also opportunities for us to do this in a visual form too. Right? We try to interpret the intention of that, and then we try to figure out what the right response should be. How do we maintain a conversation? Which, by the way, is not just about having an answer to a given question, but rather how to really maintain a context over the course of a conversation that not only reveals the answers to the questions that the person's trying to ask, but maybe even carries them through to the other questions that they hadn't thought about when they started into this conversation, but ultimately is germane to them and how they're trying to solve their problem. So we've introduced a service that we call the conversation service, and we did this specifically to enable people to create these kinds of conversational agents, to make it easy for them. And its role essentially is to do what we just described. That is to take the utterance, classify it, try to identify what the intention of the person who expressed that utterance. And by the way, don't think that that's about keyword matching. It's not. Just as it was in the case of Watson for Jeopardy, this is about trying to get to the meaning behind the expression. Recognizing that human beings don't always speak clearly. We don't always use correct grammar. We don't always say exactly what we mean, and certainly what we do say shouldn't always be taken literally. So the key here is to figure out what they really meant, what they were really trying to say, what the real intention was, which often is contextual. It requires that we understand the context of what they're saying. So we introduced this conversational service, and its intent its purpose is to enable people to build these conversational systems by classifying the intent, by mapping that onto a dialogue system, and I can tell you the dialogue systems is another area where I believe that we're going to see a lot of transformation over the next few years, and then use that to come up with an appropriate response. But if we're really going to activate the human mind, if we're really going to get to the point where we're able to inspire people to new ideas, we have to understand human beings better. The conversational system has to understand not just what the person's trying to say, but what state of mind were they in when they were trying to say it, because that goes to helping interpret their intention, right? So, and by the way, we need to be able to support vocalization and interactions that are appealing and germane to the person at the other end, given what we know about their emotion. So we can introduce variations on speech to text, but just as important is how we do text to speech. How do we vocalize a response? And how do we employ different devices of intonation and vocalization as a means for getting and conveying information in a way that people are more likely to receive? And whether that's simple things like whether you're going to accelerate the cadence or decelerate the cadence of the vocalization, whether you're going to speak with a more adult-like voice or a more childlike voice, whether you're going to introduce elements of empathetic tonal response, like, how can you demonstrate that you're a little bit more apologetic about what you're saying versus how do you represent that in a happier way. Those kinds of differences are important to achieving that kind of connection with your end audience. But then also understanding people's personality. Understanding what emotional state they're in. Are they angry? Are they frustrated? Are they disappointed? Or are they happy? Are they sad? Are they these other things? And if you think about all the gradations of our emotional state, the different states of emotion matter, right? The difference between somebody who's angry versus somebody who's disappointed matters to how you're going to respond to that person, right? If somebody's angry, chances are they're actually in a pretty irrational state of mind. They're not going to be able to work through a problem or their own issues if you're simply being logical with them, because they're already in an irrational state. You've got to get them back to a point where now they can be rational and you can work them through that. Versus somebody who's disappointed, they're both negative, but somebody who's disappointed has already rationalized their position, right? They've already come to the conclusion they don't like you, they didn't like something you did, but they're not rational about that. They've actually gotten to the point where they can be rational. So again, just a demonstration of why it matters to understand the distinction between somebody's emotional state. And then likewise, also understand their tonal state. The difference between emotion and tone largely has to do with what side of the pair you're dealing with. Somebody's emotional is how they feel. Somebody's tone is how they're trying to affect the emotion of somebody else that they're interacting with. So we can add these into the conversational system and enhance our ability to connect with the people that we're talking to, that we're conversing with. And of course, we also have to be able to find information that they care about, and so we've done a lot of work around simply being able to retrieve the information that is relevant to be able to answer the kinds of questions they might want to ask. So let me give you a little bit of a demonstration of what this looks like.
Hi, Jeff.
Hi, John. Hi, Celia. This is Jeff Kephart speaking.
Hello, Jeffrey O. Kephart.
So what would you like to cover today, John?
I'd like to go back and cover Project Zinnia, if we could.
Jeffrey,
Yes, Celia?
it sounds like you're interested in acquisitions.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like me to restore your most recent work session?
That would be great. Celia, restore my last work session. We were working on decisive analytics. There's the website for it. I have the sense that you liked this company a lot.
We have a strategic gap in this area, and Decisive Analytics fills that gap very nicely. We should look at Decisive Analytics.
Okay, so we could place decisive analytics at the center of the universe of companies. And Celia, find companies similar to the company named Decisive Analytics.
I found 100 companies that are similar to Decisive Analytics Corporation.
This is excellent. I see a couple of companies that I recognize, but the total set of companies is much broader than I would have been able to come up with myself.
Good.
I'd like to explore this in more detail.
Celia, tell me more about the company named Strategic Analysis, Inc., focused on business.
Okay.
Okay, so here's some information about it. What do you think, John?
I think government professional services, and they do software development. I think this is an excellent candidate.
So what you demonstrated here wasn't just simply the kind of scenarios that you might expect from a conversational system, one where a business is interacting with consumer-based end clients, but in particular, this were two people in an office collaborating with each other, obviously working towards a business goal, but where the conversational system is now part of that collaboration. It's participating in the conversation. It's understanding enough about the conversations occurring between the people, but also being able to respond in kind, both by making suggestions as well as reacting to requests for information. So again, I just want to give you a simple taste of where I think conversational systems are going and why these messaging platforms are becoming increasingly important. But I do believe that this is at least one good example of where we can provide cognitive systems whose result is not simply to be a set of measurements in the back end or to be able to recognize a set of trends, but rather to really amplify and change the way that we as humans think. Thank you.
We have time for about one question, and we're also going to be doing a little bit of logistical switch up with the projector here. So who has a question? Yes, sir.
Me? Oh, should I do this? Hi. So with the kind of engagement that you're doing on these agents, you know, say the bank, for example, I can imagine that you're getting a lot of very valuable information about the person, like you say, not just what they want, but their mood, their experience, their personality. I can imagine it being very valuable, obviously, to marketers. I can also imagine it kind of raising the level of concern about privacy.
Yeah.
What makes sense, or are there different ways you could regulate the privacy on that? What do you think makes sense?
So let me put this in context. Notice I didn't actually say anything about accumulating that information. I think some of the situations that you might be referring to might suggest that, if we were to pick up information about each individual and aggregate that could be interesting from a marketing standpoint. And maybe it is, and maybe it isn't, but that's not part of what we're trying to concentrate on. What we're trying to do is, in the same sense that we as human beings do this when we're having a conversation. If you think about the conversations that you have with people that you know, your family, your colleagues, et cetera, subconsciously, we are checking each other's personality. We are trying to learn something about that person because it helps us do a better job of interacting with that person and forming information in a way that is going to be meaningful to them. We're testing our understanding of their emotion, and we're using that to attenuate how we respond to them and the kinds of paths we might take in the conversation. We are trying to understand what tone, what effect they're having on other people. So it's purely for the sake of how do we do a better job of conversing with that person that I care about these sort of things in much the same way that we would as human beings do that. I think it's a separate issue and certainly one of concern that we ought to all be aware of as to what people then do with that information to aggregate it and then exploit it for marketing purposes or otherwise. Separate issue. It's just not one I'm worried about right now.
One thing is that in terms of forming a relationship with the customer, like maybe what their life events are, would it help the relationship even more if you know their personality? So
Yeah.
you actually want to serve the customer, aggregate
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, so certainly understanding the person's personality is key to having a good conversation and be able to satisfy some of their needs, both within the conversation as well as over the relationship you would have with them. Again, I want to be focused strictly on how we're applying it for the purposes of having a better conversation with them. But I do think that we have to be careful about how that information is being aggregated and used for other purposes. Okay? Thank you very much. Appreciate that.